A lot of authors like to talk about recent books. I always think that's a little bit perverse because there's very few things more boring than a book that you've just finished. And it's a real privilege to be asked to talk about a book which I finished writing 10 years ago, which is quite a long time. And so it's a real pleasure to go back to it and to think it through again and to try and connect up what I was doing then with some things that have happened since. And I kind of want to give you a little guided tour of how that's developed. Some of you I know the book, others perhaps not, and I'll kind of give an introduction. But as I go along, I also want to point to ways in which my thinking has moved. But I started 10 years ago with what is a question which has been posed over and over and over again since the end of the Third Reich, which was simply, and really since the end of World War II, which was, how was this possible? How was it possible that for the second time in a generation, Germany should have embarked on a disastrously failed effort to restructure global power that ended in defeat? How was it possible that a society like Germany could have unleashed the horror that the Third Reich did? How could Germany have inserted itself so catastrophically into world history in the grandest sense, in the way that Nazi Germany did? And I posed that question against a particular historiographical, against a particular backdrop of historical writing which shaped my generation, and which amplified the problem, pointed to some kind of answers, but left me feeling fundamentally unsatisfied. And one great force shaping my generation was a pile of literature, a trend in the historical writing, which insisted that we must take Hitlerine, Nazi ideology deadly seriously, that this was not to be joked with or diminished or trivialized in the way in which perhaps an earlier generation of writing about the Third Reich did. Hugh Trevor Roper, the immediate aftermath of World War II, was full of a kind of slightly contemptuous literature. It's not that we had any sympathy for Nazi ideology, it's just that we began to take it deadly seriously as a driving force, an animating force of this regime. At the same time also, particularly in Germany, which is where I grew up and which shaped me profoundly in my thinking about the Third Reich, a generation of historians were insisting we had to take not just the ideology in the sense of atmospheric ideas or general ideas about anti-Semitism seriously, but look in great detail at the technocratic ambitions of the Nazi regime to transform the landscape of Europe, the geopolitical map, in racialized ways, in their most extensive form, in the form of the Generalplan Ost, shaped by a group of social scientists in Germany, really from the summer of 1940 onwards, reaching its full extent in 1942, and I hope you can see, calling for a full-scale reorganization of the map of Europe up to the line that runs from the Baltic through to the Black Sea. On ethnic grounds, huge displacements of people running into the tens of the millions, vast infrastructure projects, the black lines of railways and motorways, a complete new land settlement, a kind of conquest of Eastern Europe, like the conquest of the Midwest of the United States. So we were driving towards taking the Nazi regime, if you like, at face value, in the most literal sense, in all of its most aggressive, its most ambitious schemes. But the problem for somebody who came from an economic history background was the question of how we relate this kind of vaulting ideological ambition to the underlying realities of the German economy, which, as I'll tell you in a minute, was itself undergoing a re-evaluation by historians, economic historians, at this point. And the basic wager of this book is that we can tell the history of the Nazi regime as the clashing, the grinding of the cogs, in the end, explosion of the gearbox, if you like, that linked this radical ambition of the Nazi regime to the economic potential of Germany. That this is really one way of capturing the extremity of the Nazi regime's ambition and the limits on which that was based. And I'm going to approach that with a series of metaphors before I get into some of the finer details of this argument. And what I took, and where I'm, as it were, hugely indebted to military history, particularly American military history, but that also of the Freiburg Military Institute in Germany, sponsored by the Bundeswehr, from the 1970s onwards, one way in which the regime struggled to contain this tension between its vast ambitions and its limited means were two types of technical fix, if you like. And one of those technical fixes was provided by the military themselves. At an operational level, the genius of the great operational planners and soldiers of the German army, exemplified, of course, by the figure of Erich von Manstein, the architect of the Sichelschnitt, the scything blow that conquered France in 1940, and the great, extraordinary defensive manoeuvring on the Eastern Front, notably in 1943. This is what makes him Times Man of the Year. Incongruously, somebody was asking me, well after America has entered the war, in fact, when fighting is already quite bitter in North Africa, he's still on the cover because he looks as though he may be able to extend the Eastern Front into the far distant future. Not just at the operational level, however, but already during World War II, a kind of mystique had begun to surround the German fighting forces, a kind of eerie capacity for resistance and effectiveness, which echoes down to the present in images like this, the fantasy of Blitzkrieg, the modern ultimate soldier who in some sense can overcome every obstacle and all odds to sustain the German war effort. So this was one of the fixes with which the Nazi regime struggled to contain the tension between the scale of its ambition and the resources at its disposal. But the element that interested me most, the triangle that I was trying to sketch, was that between that ideological ambition and the skill and the fighting effectiveness of the German military, and a third element, which is that of economic management and resource management. And the figure who is absolutely central for this is this early exponent of the PowerPoint slide, Albert Speer, who from early 42 onwards moves to the center of the German war effort as the man who is forever after associated with the extraordinary effort to rationalize and mobilize the German war effort, and as he is doing here, sketch out a path ever upwards. This is, remember, June 1944. It's either the week immediately before or the week immediately after D-Day and Operation Bagration. In other words, as the roof is falling in, he's there with his PowerPoint slides, telling the German leadership that all is well. Just look at this incredible increase in armaments production that we are achieving. And this figure, who encapsulated within himself, as it were, both rational efficiency and the pressures of modern economic growthmanship, you might say. He's almost a post-war figure, a Walt Rostow kind of a figure. And on the other hand, of course, that other aspect of Albert Speer's activity, namely his role as one of the chief, literally, architects, but also in a metaphorical sense, creators of the imaginary world of National Socialism. Albert Speer is Leni Riefenstahl's great collaborator in The Triumph of the Will. Here, Albert and Adolf putting the finishing touches on the wedding cake of National Socialist monumentality. And here, Leni Riefenstahl on the set of The Triumph of the Will, which features both the masses orchestrated by the Nazi Party and the buildings constructed by Albert Speer as the stage. Note here the gesture, the dynamic interwar postures of modernity, echoed, I think, strikingly in this image from the proving grounds of the Wehrmacht Armaments Ministry in 1943. Speer there, Leni Riefenstahl there. It's a very distinctively modern pose for the leadership of the Nazi regime to be striking, with Hitler himself featured on this half-track. What I'm trying to summon up, what I was trying to capture, was this incredible blending of a kind of mythology and a mythologization, which Goebbels and Speer collaborated to literally call the armaments miracle, with the technical nuts and bolts of actually making the German armaments economy run. For me, it's akin to the sorts of descriptions of modern power that we find in cinematography of the mid-century, famously Federico Fellini's account of the extraordinary airlift of a giant Jesus statue over a Roman aqueduct at the beginning of the Dolce Vita. And on the other hand, Sieberberg's, if you haven't seen it, go out, book a weekend and watch it, 1970s rock opera of Hitler emerging from the Wagnerian undergrowth. It's an extraordinary, I think, moment in which power and economic production and the capacity of image making is merged together in a new way. And to do justice to what the Nazi regime is, we have to capture all of these elements together. If you think this is a little far-fetched, the following slide, I think, does the job. This is literally Arno Breker, Hitler's favorite sculpture, doing a knocking off a bust of Albert Speer as the war surges around them. A Fellini-esque moment, if there ever was one. And back to Albert Speer. So this, another reverse angle, a different angle on that same moment with the PowerPoint slides. So what I was trying to capture in this book is this extraordinary tension, which is not just sitting on the outside of the economic management of the German war effort, but if you like, as I'm suggesting by way of the figure of Albert Speer, inserted into it, within the German management of the war economy, are elements of a kind of a triumph of the will, an effort to assert the possibility of the overcoming of limitations by means of technology, by means of willpower, by means of organization and effort. A kind of, there are analogies here, of course, to the Stakhanovite movement in the Soviet Union at the same time, or the sorts of mobilizations we will see in the United States during World War II and in China afterwards. To me, the tension in the project that I'm, and this is my last kind of effort at metaphorical approach, the tensions in the project that I was embarked upon are quite well captured by the Icarus myth. Because to capture the logic of the Icarus story, we of course need to reference the hot sun of the Mediterranean and the melting point of wax and the inevitable action of gravity on a falling body from that moment onwards. But to capture what the Icarus myth is about, those material constraints, those binding laws have got to be combined, of course, with the mad human desire to fly in the first place. And it's that I was trying to, that tension that I was really trying to grasp in thinking about the Third Reich. Not, as some of my historian colleagues had done, to tell the story of the mad ambition alone, or as some economic historians have done, to tell the story only of the sun, the wax, and gravity, but to merge these two together, to see them in their tense interaction with each other. In the unfolding of this extraordinary drama, a tragedy, I think, or of sorts at least in its logical structure, that leads inevitably to the end, to the destruction of Hitler's regime. And I say that advisedly, and I say that even though I know that deep down, most historians and many people who read history are profoundly uncomfortable with the idea of inevitability. So what do I mean by that? On the one hand, of course, I don't mean inevitability like the kind of gravity that acts on the body of Icarus. And I don't mean to exclude counterfactual argument as though it was unnecessary or impossible. It seems to me virtually impossible to talk seriously about history without entertaining the speculations of counterfactual argument. That's one of the bizarre ironies, paradoxes of our profession. As soon as you become serious about claiming causation, you claim counterfactual bases for doing so. What I am saying, however, is that the destruction of Hitler's regime was vastly more likely than not, that it's far easier to imagine many different ways, many different scenarios in which his regime is destroyed earlier and even more decisively than it was, than it is to imagine alternatives in which it survives, let alone emerges victorious. And I'm going to insist upon this, and this is the burden of the rest of what I'm going to say this evening in the wonderfully generous time allowed, that I believe that this is fundamentally rooted in the economics. And to make that claim, one of the things that the book has to do, and I had to do this evening, is to overcome a certain sort of prejudice that we have about Germany and German history as far as economics is concerned. Because when you say that this was inevitable, the catastrophic defeat of one of the finest armies the world has ever seen, a single GI guiding tens of thousands of German soldiers surrendered in the Ruhr pocket in the spring of 1945, and that this is inevitable on the basis, if you like, of economic foundations, or far more likely than not on the basis of economic foundations, there is a reaction which simply says, you must be kidding. The German economy, after all, is one of the most potent in the world already at that point. Surely it is. This is a rather amazing aerial shot of the Ruhr, the heartland of West German heavy industry in the 1920s. Surely, this is what we know about the German economy. This is the potent base for German power from the Franco-Prussian War onwards. And what we know now only confirms this sense. If we think about Europe today, the logic of economics would seem to be driving Europe ever more into the hands of the Germans. So is it not deeply perverse, Tooze, to insist that precisely on the basis of the economy, German power should be fragile? And it's precisely that which was the argument of this book. Yes, indeed, it's in the economy that we will see the fragility. And here again, I'm the product of my moment. Any, I think, self-critical and self-conscious historian owes it to himself or herself and their readers to be aware of the kind of ways in which our thinking is shaped by our surroundings. And I was, on the one hand, a Brit growing up between Britain and Germany in the 60s and 70s, burdened with that sense of British decline and German dominance, which was so much a feature of that moment, a little bit akin to America's anxiety about the rise of Japan. And on the other hand, also part of that generation which was set free from that sense of British declinism and German dominance in the 1990s. And this wasn't just an atmospheric thing, cool Britannia, Tony Blair and all that. It was also driven by fundamental shifts in our understanding of modern economic history, which through carefully elaborated comparative data sets revealed things which are truly quite surprising about the development not just of the European, but the world economy over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. And specifically, these three books, Angus Maddison's global data set supplied by the OECD, Steve Broadberry's comparison of productivity in British, German and American industry, and Mark Harrison's work on the economics of World War II. And coming from a military history background, this is the one book to get for Christmas. It's a fantastic summation of our thinking about the economics of World War II in the early 2000s. These works together shaped my understanding. And what they do, what they tell us, if we look at the basic measures of macroeconomic performance, of total economic clout, is something quite conclusive. And this is what I mean by that inevitability. Here you have the graphs showing, not per capita, but the total economic firepower of the major power blocks. This is also the frame of my more recent book, Deluge. On the one hand here, you have the British Empire, all in. Here you have the compact continental nation state of the United States. And down here, so interwoven with each other that they're hard to tell apart, you've got the also-rans of global power in the first half of the 20th century. That means you've got France, you've got Japan, you've got Germany and Russia. And yes, our best guess of GDP, not per capita, because Russia's clearly backward, but allowing for Russia's greater size, total GDP is that you cannot separate Russia and Germany over the entire period that we can measure GDP for modern Russia and modern Germany. In other words, there are really two leagues. There's the Global Power League, which is the global power league of the British Empire and the United States, and there are the rest. The continental powers, which operate at a lower level of economic potential, and Germany and Russia are remarkably close. France is behind, the Japan is really an also-ran. How could this be? What are the underpinnings of this perhaps counterintuitive idea? Well, this is where phenomenally interesting new data on productivity really drove the story. And what I really want to focus on is these two panels here, where you can see, maybe I move over and shout a little bit so it's easier for me to directly. So the crucial distinctions are within the sectors across countries. So look at Germany and Britain, first of all. And the really remarkable thing is that through to the middle of the 20th century, big sectors of the German economy are, let's go this way around, at a level, broadly speaking, with Britain. Here's the story that's familiar about industry. In other words, productivity per worker in German industry is a little bit better than Britain's, surprise, surprise, or broadly the same as Britain's for most of the 20th century. But look across the other sectors, and above all, look in agriculture. And here you see that German agriculture is, broadly speaking, half as efficient as British agriculture. Why that matters, really matters, we'll see in a minute. The other major comparison is, in a sense, the standout story of 20th century economic history, the United States. Because whereas British and German industry are pretty much of a muchness, which is hardly surprising, because engineers go back and forth, workers go back and forth, it's essentially a very tightly nested economy. This is the story of global American dominance. Worker for worker, already by the 1920s, American workers are twice as efficient as not just their British but their German counterparts. Massively so, level pecking with the British in agriculture. Why does this comparison matter so much? Because as a result of its early industrial revolution, Germany, Britain and the United States are at radically different levels of economic development when the 20th century begins. You can't see that from the productivity so much within industry, but look at their overall distribution of workers. And here, again, striking differences. Spaceship Britain, the first society to stop farming, first big society to stop farming since the Neolithic, founded modern civilization. The first society to have less than 10% of its workforce in agriculture living in the city. On the other hand, the United States and Germany, much slower to industrialize, much slower to let go of their agricultural workforce, holding on to very significant numbers of farmers all the way down to the post-war period. And this matters so much because productivity levels are so much lower. Germany has 3 times as many people in agriculture at half the level of productivity in Britain during this period. And that, in and of itself, by itself, is enough to account for a really dramatic difference in economic firepower in this period. Germany is a country which, during World War II, throughout the period of World War II, had more people in its farming economy than in uniform in the Wehrmacht. 11 million adult workers employed in German agriculture, a sector so inefficient that even with 11 million workers, it cannot secure the food supply of the Reich. On the contrast, in Britain, you've got single-digit percentages working in agriculture. The significance of this, from the point of view of a macroeconomic assessment of firepower, of capacity to project power, simply cannot be exaggerated. And what it makes sense of is images like this. This weird incongruity between a Stug self-propelled gun and German cavalry. Or this even more striking image of a Tiger tank alongside the standard means of logistics for the German infantry, a horse wagon from 1942, I think this is, an early Tiger. This remarkable image of horse-powered anti-aircraft guns. Now, that's the kind of juxtaposition that you see in a society like Germany. Britain, famously, by the days of Dunkirk, 39-40, has no horses in the British Expeditionary Force, has so many trucks, they use them as piers when they have to evacuate through Dunkirk. The Germans had never seen anything like it, because the vast majority of their logistics looks like this. It looks like the Civil War. This is an image you could have taken from either of the armies of the 1860s. It's an image you frankly could have taken from the Napoleonic era, but there wouldn't have been any photos. But this is how war was conducted by the Germans in 1940, 41, 42. 600,000 horses invade the Soviet Union with the Germans. This, I think, is the onus, correct? If anyone else has got more images like this, I'd be delighted to see them. This is the largest aggregation of Wehrmacht horses I have ever seen in a photo. You see these scattered images quite often, but to actually see this kind of encampment, just like in the Civil War, is really very striking. And having put that photo up, I can give you another way of thinking about this, and really, I think, add credibility to it in a way that perhaps it didn't have in wages and really ought to have had. Which is that, well, this is numbers of cars produced, and really all it's showing you is the Germans aren't, at this point, the major producers of cars which we take for granted in the 20th century. They're still a minor producer of cars. Thank you so much, Robert. The technology here is absolutely fantastic in its own creaky way. It's brilliant. So here you have the, nobody knew you could do this. We have all this modern stuff at Yale and Columbia, and I've never known that you could do this with a projector. It's absolutely brilliant. So here's US production of cars, millions of them. Here's British production of cars, which outruns the Germans in this period. And there's the Germans catching up, and largely, of course, not to their own efforts, but to do with General Motors' massive investment in Opel from 1928 onwards, which makes Opel into its hub for global exports outside the United States. So that's a kind of American co-production in here. But numbers like this make it far more understandable why, As we in fact know, the British outproduced the Germans in aircraft. Why the Spitfire's a better aircraft than the ME-109? Why the British can produce 4-engined bombers by the thousand in the way that the Germans can't? Because in key areas of modern technology, the Germans are not the dominant cutting-edge power that they will become by the 1970s. They are, in fact, and this is where this gets a little bit tendentious, because what we're going to use here is purchasing power parity adjusted numbers. So we adjust away for every conceivable form of inflation across countries and across time. We actually think that Germany's GDP per capita in 1936 was about $4,400 per head, modern money. Now, take me back to that picture of horses, and what I'm going to tell you is that Germany in the 1930s has a per capita income roughly comparable to that of most of Latin America today, or much of Asia other than China today. It is like those societies, a weird mixture of extremely modern radar, jet fighters, early efforts at atomic engineering, and on the other hand, logistics like this, and aircraft, anti-aircraft guns tugged by horses. Note, these ones have got rubber tires, very, very important. The standard German logistical vehicle, look at this, has got steel-rimmed or iron-rimmed wheels. Hopeless over any kind of rough terrain. A nightmare. They dig in. Anyone who's ever attempted to move anything, a trailer, without inflatable tires. This is a very low-tech army. And it's that hodgepodge, that weirdness, that juxtaposition that we have to grasp if we're thinking about the Third Reich. And the next point to make is that the Germans knew it. One of the things that we have struggled to understand about this regime is precisely that we exaggerate how well off, how affluent, how powerful they were, whereas they are haunted by their sense of inferiority. Hitler is nothing except a man with an inferiority complex. He is struggling to come to terms with a world which, as he describes here in his unpublished second book, a colportage of essays and speeches that he's gave, is already, if you like, under the influence of what we would today call globalization. Hitler, 1928. The European today dreams of a standard of living which he derives as much from Europe's actual possibilities as from the real conditions of America. Due to modern technology and the communication it makes possible, the international relations amongst people have become so close that the European, even without being fully conscious of it, applies as the yardstick for his life the conditions of American life. He's apt to forget that the relationship of surface area, Hitler's obsession, Lebensraum, to the population of the American continent is vastly superior. So what he's describing is a society caught between vaulting expectations of a good life actually realized in America and the limited conditions of the old world. And you see that in the sorts of projects that the regime sponsors. Look here, Hitler, we're going to put the engine at the back. No one's ever done this before. It looks crazy, but it's really compact and it makes space at the front. We can make a family car this small and it'll only cost 999 marks. Promise, once we have the right savings scheme in place. This is an expression of that desire to escape the American obsession with the car. You've got to have a car to be modern, but Germany can't really afford it. It turns out that it can't really afford these, either at the time. None are produced or sold until after World War II. Germans must have radios. They must have radios apart from anything else so they can listen to the Führer. The problem is virtually no Germans can, well, roughly 25% of Germans can afford a radio in 1933. So as much propaganda as you pump out, as many rules as you make about not listening to the BBC, it's really not relevant to 3/4 of the German population. So what does Germany have to do? It has to create the radio counterpart to the VW Beetle, unimaginatively known as the Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, or the ethnic, racial comrades receiver, as you can see here. Surrogates, if you like, substitutes, ersatz products of mass consumption, anticipating what should come in the future, delivered right now by the Nazi regime at a price, it turns out. So there's a sense within the Nazi regime that they don't have what they need. This is a fundamental driver of the regime's ambition to satisfy people whose images of what is good and the good life are already shaped by America, by Radio City Music Hall, by Hollywood, but are well beyond the actual means of ordinary Europeans. And the Germans, the Nazi regime doesn't just know it in this impressionistic sense. They actually, as I discovered, in part as a result of my very early work on the history of statistics, but then also combing through the files of the German ministries, they know it in a technical sense. The first efforts to produce exactly the kind of statistics that I was citing as so influential in the 1980s and 1990s in changing our mind about the balance of world economic order were already being produced in the 1930s. And imagine, I knew about this in a technical sense, that this was an innovation of 1936, 37, 38, that Australian Colin Clark had worked these out. Imagine my elation when I discovered copies, German translations, of Colin Clark's data in the files of the German Armaments Ministry. They are actually assessing themselves in the same way as America today assesses the rise of China, using purchasing power parity adjusted GDP and GDP per capita numbers. And they already, at this period, knew exactly what I am insisting upon as the organizing idea for any economic history of the regime. In other words, look, here's the total throw weight of the German economy. It's about a quarter of the throw weight of the United States and less than that of Britain. In per capita terms, they're pretty close exactly to where we would actually think, substantially below Britain, 477 for Britain, 271. The units don't matter here, it's the ratios that are important. And you can see the United States way ahead of Germany, twice Germany's per capita income, and then here the ratios. And these are very much, give or take, a little bit of adjustment here or there, what we would take for granted today. In the files of the German planners assessing their own situation, mein Führer, this is what we are up against. Now, if this is true, and as powerful as I'm suggesting it is, the obvious next question is, what on earth were they thinking? How on earth could they have gone up against these kind of odds? And the answer, of course, is that German politics in the 1920s was dominated precisely by that thought. And there is no figure more iconically representative of that German concession of leadership to the United States than the most important figure of German foreign policy in this period, Gustav Stresemann, who was a business economist, made a trip to the United States in the era of Teddy Roosevelt, came home incredibly impressed by this. The first conclusion he drew was, okay, window of strategic opportunity, charge through as quickly as possible, back German imperialism to the hilt in World War I, see whether we can't make a bid, a gamble to establish a German living space. The defeat of World War I for Stresemann is a shattering experience, precisely because he is such an aggressive imperialist. He literally suffers a nervous breakdown over the winter of 1919-1920, and he emerges as the arch advocate of acceptance, of subordination, of appeasement, if you like, of American power. Safety for Germany will lie, as it does today, nested underneath a security umbrella constituted by American naval power and American money. And that is the future for Germany, as a powerful country and influential country, by all means asserting its interests against nasty East European neighbours, but not fundamentally challenging for world power, exercising its influence, as you can see here, in collaboration with the great French statesman of the same period, Aristide Briand. But as I canvass in the more recently published book, Deluge, what I do there is look across the world at Japan in the Shidehara period, in Britain, in France in this period, and you see the same process of recognition, adjustment, and settlement in all those countries in the 1920s. The acceptance of the conclusion that inevitably follows from this data. In other words, American power supervenes, dominates, and is going to reorganize and change the nature of power in the 20th century. And woe betide those who go up against it. And, of course, its allies, its unsinkable aircraft carriers, are in Europe. What is it that gives Hitler his chance? Well, in 1928-29, Hitler is a completely marginal figure. In the 1928 election, he scores, I think, just over 2% of the national vote. Nobody reckons with Hitler as a significant figure. What gives Hitler his chance, and this is an eerie foreshadowing of our present circumstance, is the catastrophic collapse of American world power in the wake of the Great Depression. The underpinnings are ripped out from underneath the politics of people like Stresemann by the collapse of the world economy. If your basic argument is that American economic power is the framing structure of the world, then that economic power has to be seen to be robust and stable. Otherwise, you lose the argument. And in the early 1930s, in Japan, in Germany, in Italy, even in France and Britain, those who support cooperation with America lose the argument. Britain and France default, the mildest thing you can do. We know what Italy, Japan, and Germany do. And Hitler, from 1933 onwards, is catapulting his country through the strategic window of opportunity that opens up as American power crumbled in the early 1930s, and particularly in that disastrous coincidence between Hitler's rise to power and the first 100 isolationist days of the Roosevelt administration, in which America pulls back from world power, and into that window the Third Reich plunges. Not Hitler alone, of course, but an entire coalition of nationalists explicitly taking on. And again, this is Hitler on America in 1929. Unless the political leaders of Europe could shake their populations out of their usual political thoughtlessness. Ooh, what just happened? Can you take me back? Because this is a good quote. There we go. Right? Unless we can shake our populations out of their usual political thoughtlessness, truly, it turns out, 20th and 21st century thoughtlessness, the threatened global hegemony of the North American continent would reduce them all to the status of, oh my God, Switzerland or Holland. Holy cheese and cuckoo clocks. In future, the only state that will be able to stand up to North America will be the one which has understood how, through the essence of its inner life and the meaning of its foreign policy, to raise the value of its people in racial terms and to bring them into the state form most appropriate for this purpose. And then, capsule, nugget, it is the task of the National Socialist movement to strengthen and to prepare its fatherland for this task. The task being to take on the great challenge of American power in the 20th century. You see the same thing echoing, of course, in Japan in exactly the same period. That is the great challenge facing both of them. They more or less self-consciously face up to it. And not Hitler alone, but a coalition of figures. And for our purposes, most importantly, financial and economic figures. On the right-hand side, Hjalmar Schacht, Germany's central banker, and on the left-hand side, a key industrialist. This here is the elder Krupp, the one who should have been on trial in 1945, not his son. The Americans literally tried the wrong guy, banged him up anyway, and he was guilty. But this is the more guilty person. Hitler, in 1933, in the fall, not coincidentally, choosing the stage of one of Germany's greatest companies, all the way down to the present day, Siemens, to appeal to the German worker, the German businessman, to back him unanimously in the break with the League of Nations and disarmament talks in that fall. Building a national coalition, completely male, as you can see in this picture, workers and managers joined together in the national struggle. And for the purpose of the single largest transfer of economic resource ever seen, up to that point and since, outside the communist world, the transformation of the German economy from its depressed state in 1932 to an economy that is not just fully employed, but massively mobilized for war in a way the world has never seen before. Between 32 and 38, the share of the military in German GDP shoots up from 0.8% to 20.5%. So that's going from 0 to the footprint of the American health industrial complex in America today. Doctors, hospitals, nurses, physiotherapy, the whole works, that's the kind of footprint which Germany is moving towards. Another way of thinking about it will be from 0 to Korean War levels of mobilization in Germany in the space of 7 years. We talk about an arms race in the 1930s, and we suggest it might be a little bit like the arms race before 1914, dreadnoughts and so on. Maximum spending before 1914, 3.5% to 4% of GDP in that period that we think of, in retrospect, as highly militarized. This is 5 times that and at higher levels of GDP. So this is a quantum leap in the way in which you would escalate and militarize a society. An absolutely dramatic transformation. And as you can see, the Germans really on a par with the Soviet Union and out-mobilizing both the UK and the US through World War II as well. This is not a feel-good dictatorship. This is a demanding, insistent, massively mobilizing, draconian in its violence, even towards its own people, in mobilizing resource for war. But the basic argument that I then make in the book, to shift from the generalities of this setup to the specific argument of wages, is to say money only goes so far. And it particularly only goes so far under circumstances of full employment and near inflation. And under circumstances like that, it's not money, it's not paper, it's not gold even that matters, it's control of key resources. And from this moment onwards, the narrative of wages of destruction, in a fairly rigorous way, is driven by the concern for three material resources, which I'll weave together in the time that I've got left today, which are steel, labor, and food. And it's around the manipulation of those three elements that I argue the political economy and this tragic shattering of a vision of power can best be understood. What do I mean by that, and what do we mean specifically? Well, you compile data. What I did was to set myself to compiling the first large-scale compendium of steel production in the Third Reich and who got it and what for. And the basic story of the book can be summarized in the surging levels of allocation to the armed forces that you can just about see here and will be easier to see in a graph like this. This is above all the allocation of steel to the army, the most steel-hungry of the weapons, of the armament sectors in the Third Reich. The army will use steel above all for weapons, for fortifications. The Germans build their own Maginot Line in the Westphal, and of course, and above all, and this is the key swing variable of the modern war economy, ammunition. So this is a kind of retro account of the economics of World War II in the sense that we, of course, know that air war will come to dominate, but what I'm insisting upon from the point of view of raw material mobilization is the centrality of steel as a bottleneck. And what I am able to show is that steel has three really interesting aspects to it. First of all, mobilizing steel is massively political because the people who make it are not mom and pop stores, and they're not working class Germans organized in the Socialist Party. The people who make steel are the barons of German business. And if you are pushing them around, you are taking on the hardcore of old power in Germany. And the politics of that, I think, is an underrated and key element in the regime, the history of which I think we could even say more about. I'll come back to that. The second element is that you can see through steel long-term planning, because building steelworks like this takes time, it takes planning, and it requires forethought and preparation, and it has implications. And it's not for nothing that a crisis of raw materials, and above all steel in 1936, triggers the four-year plan, in which, in an astonishing move, in the fall of 1936, Hitler instructs his army to be ready for aggressive war within 4 years. Now, all armies plan for war, famously. Many societies notionally have in mind some program of conquest. It's extremely unusual for a modern society to pre-program an act of aggression 4 years ahead of time. And it is driven, in this case, literally by the project to build more steel capacity. And the third thing that I was able to show, which is in some senses even more surprising, is not that just that it's political and that it's strategic, but it turns out that steel was used by the Third Reich to fine-tune the German economy. That's the point of this graph here. They turn it on, they turn it off, they reallocate it from quarter to quarter between exports, domestic investment, and armaments production. And the thing that I was able to show about this is that Hitler has his hands all over this process all the time. This is how Hitler, quite a lot of the time, likes to think of himself. A man in action, on the construction site, sketching out his latest idea. The significance of that, if you know your Hitler historiography, is that in an account of Hitler like that, for instance, in the fantastic 2-volume history by Ian Kershaw, you get a very, very different image of what Hitler was about. It's the bohemian, the guy who doesn't like to get up early in the morning, who really kind of idles his time away with random projects and then puts himself to bed with a rusk, warm milk, and a Hollywood movie, right? My Hitler is a Hitler who has his hands on the key instruments of power, and above all, steel. There is not one single reallocation of steel at any point in the history of the Third Reich that was not said so by Hitler, overseen by him, and closely monitored by him. And even in moments of the direst crisis, and most spectacularly, if we go back to this graph, in the crisis of 1938-39, the aftermath of the Sudeten crisis. Because as you can see here, and quite astonishingly, in the aftermath of the Sudeten crisis, after ramping up, the German army and the German Luftwaffe face the prospect not of further accelerating armaments production as they head towards war, but of throttling it. And into this crisis, Hitler intervenes, and it's out of this crisis, the sudden deceleration and the effort to make sense of that deceleration and to figure out how to respond to it, that Hitler responded with one of his most dramatic interventions, which was his speech of the January 1939. In January 1939, Hitler goes before the Reichstag and says, this is the anniversary of the seizure of power, 6 years on, comrades, we face an absolute crisis. And the severity of this crisis can be seen by the gathering forces of what? By the gathering forces of the world Jewish conspiracy. We face a situation of absolute extremity. We are desperately short of raw materials, unable to export. Comrades, we must export or die. But if world Jewry drives us towards a global war, then I tell you now that it will not be us, but them that pays this time. Out of a crisis of raw material allocation, out of the impasse of the German armaments effort in early 1939, Hitler summons up nothing less than the threat of the Holocaust. And Hitler is covering this day by day, week by week in this period. One of the most exciting archival finds of my life was to discover in the files of the people responsible for steel an urgent memo from Hitler's office saying the Führer wants to know what the implications of the latest steel ration cut are for armaments production, and we need this yesterday. And when the office doesn't do it over the weekend, they chase on the Monday and say the Führer wants to know what the implication of the cuts are going to be. And they send to Hitler this chart here. This is what Germany could produce if we got steel back on track. Look at the dent, early 39. This is what we are going to produce if we stay with the current steel allocations. This is the stuff, day by day, of micromanaging the German war effort, even at its moments of maximum crisis. And what it tells you from the spring of 1939 onwards is that Hitler has nothing to gain by waiting. Hitler has nothing to gain by waiting because the raw material circumstances are getting so constrained. If you follow steel through, in other words, you can see the pulse speed, you can see the direction, you can see the heartland, the key areas of the politics of the German war economy. What you can see is that in its priorities, the German war effort in the early phase is not a deliberate blitzkrieg, but it's a massive allocation of steel to the production of ammunition for the purposes of a North European slugging match. The same sort of battle that Germany fought in 1914 when they famously almost ran out of ammunition after 2 months of fighting. Hitler was desperate to avoid that. There is no indication in the allocation of strategic raw materials that they anticipate the great blow that they will strike in May 1940. Having stunned themselves by the summer of 1940 with the huge success of what everybody by that point is calling the Blitzkrieg, they then actually set out to fight one of these new things which we've just invented, namely a Blitzkrieg campaign in Eastern Europe against the Soviet Union. And because it's going to be a Blitzkrieg campaign, we aren't going to need the steel allocated to ammunition. So in the aftermath of the victory over the French, steel allocation collapses, ammunition production collapses, and they go into the battle with the Soviet Union with a maximum upfront equipment, minimal provision of existing ammunition to fight their way into the Soviet Union, destroy the Soviet Union in the space of a matter of months, they hope, and then prevail and shift priorities in the wider global war against Britain and ultimately the United States. We, of course, know it doesn't come like that. And from the early spring of 1942 onwards, they have to shift gear and return Germany to an ammunition-producing, mass production war economy. There's an image shift that's involved here. When we think about World War I, we instinctively think about ammunition production. When we think about World War II, we instinctively think of aircraft production. In fact, the vast bulk of heavy resources in Germany in World War II, as in World War I, were consumed by ammunition. It remains the key swing variable. And steel, in some sense, remains the dominant factor, I would argue, in deciding relative throw weight and the ultimate outcome on the battlefield. It's the lack of firepower which fundamentally, in the end, spells the doom of the German armies. Told in this story here, told with cartoons like this, the huge sluice gate of Lend-Lease that's about to drown the beastly fascists at the bottom of the dike. In aircraft production numbers like this, Lend-Lease deliveries to Britain in 1941, 5,000 aircraft. German deliveries from occupied France and Netherlands, 78 aircraft. United States aircraft production by 1943, the infeasibly huge number of 85,000 aircraft, which is more than all the Europeans put together. But this is no more really than the logic of the numbers with which we started. The ratio, it's hard to see from the back, but the ratio of steel production in 1939 was 4-to-1 against Germany. The ratio of armaments production by the end of the war is roughly 4-to-1 against Germany. If all you had was the steel statistics, you would be able, I would argue, to predict the final outcome of the attritional war, or at least the attritional elements of combat in World War II. Where would I go from here? And I think one is entitled, in a 10-year review of a book like this, to speculate a little bit. I'll do this briefly before I move on to the second strand of the argument, which is food, about what else one might have done. And I would argue in retrospect that I regret not pushing even further into this story of steel. One of the things that I should have done more, and regret not doing and plan to do in future, is to follow up the characters in images like this. Who are the actresses? Who are the actors? Who are the big businessmen that actually constituted the politics of World War II? Who in particular is the man behind Speer enthusiastically saluting? This man here, Edmund Geilenberg, with his newly awarded Knight's Cross for services to the German war effort. Geilenberg is the driving force behind the ammunition program of Germany in this period. An employee of the Reichswerke Hermann Göring, the head honcho in what Speer described as the committee system which ran the armaments production effort. And he's a man with an office. This is his office, Arbeitsstab Geilenberg, and it's a man with a telephone book. And if you're serious, I would argue, about understanding the network that drove the German war effort, and what I'm planning to do over the next couple of years, perhaps a little bit on the back burner, is simply to follow up the telephone book of the Speer ministry. Who had whose number in their Rolodex, and what were they using those numbers for? And if you do that, and you go inside Geilenberg's organization, what you get is a spreadsheet like this. So these are all the subcommittees that sat within his major committee. What I've done already is to identify the type of ammunition down the side here. So this is heaviest, 20.3 centimeter heavy caliber. So this is a man called Heinrich Plumper, about which it would be nice to know more. He's a director of, what is it, the Bochumer Verein, one of the heaviest foundry operations in Germany. Smaller caliber ammunition, 3.7 centimeter. Who is it? Well, it's a guy called Sebastian Hammerich. I don't know much about him yet, but he looks like an interesting character because he's associated with Polter, which is, again, the sort of thing that one only begins to develop a feel for if you follow this through. Polter turns out the largest global producer of ammunition, run a whole network of concentration camp driven armaments, ammunition factories centered on Magdeburg. Tracing out these networks is something I'm going to try and crowdsource through the internet over years to come, drawing on the enormous expertise of local historians and industrial specialists across Germany to finally unpick this entire telephone book. There's, as a starter, about 250 names, so it's a very manageable problem. It's not big data we're talking about here, but I think it will be quite revealing. The other direction, and so then you can map it onto actual companies, and here's the different sizes of the German companies. We could say more about this in Q&A. The other direction in which I've already gone is down onto the factory floor, down onto the workshop floor to see what people were doing with the steel. And in particular, I stumbled across a couple of years ago this amazing inventory. It's like a head count, a census, not of people or of workers, but of machine tools. Every single different type of machine tool, 200 different types of tools separately classified by age, by size, counted across the German economy, giving us an extraordinary impression of the growth of the machine tool stock and its significance. A doubling from 1.2 to 2.2 million machine tools dotted across the German economy, ready for armaments production. And we can break them down, if we can shrink that again, we can break them down by machine type. And if you get expert in metal machining, you can begin to make interesting guesses about who's doing what where and what kind of mass production activity is going on, depending on the type of tool. And the third direction, in which I had gone much more decisively, and this is really a question also of historiographical culture, is towards what these people are making. I've already stressed the importance of ammunition, the most nondescript, if you like, of the armaments type, the stuff that's just a shell and blows up. It's actually more interesting than that. As many of you will know, there's very rapid technological development in ammunition in this period. But more generally, what I think there is a glaring gap, particularly amongst, if you like, the more highbrow, more academically respectable military history, a glaring gap with regard to our knowledge about the essential hardware that accompanies military history, in other words, the weapon systems. And what I wish I had pushed towards is a closer analysis of a scene like this, which is a picture of men in the first instance. But anyone who knows anything about infantry combat knows that the really crucial thing here is that this is a portrait of a machine gunner. And this is a portrait of a machine gunner wielding the most fearsome German light infantry weapon of the later war, the MG42. And the more you look and the more you become conscious of the iconography of the war, and this is just one instance of this, you see this weapon everywhere, and is the standard image of the infantryman forever after, all the way down, of course, to the M60 in use in the American Army, a replica in some ways of the MG42. What is the history of this weapon? Who made it? How was it used? How was it produced? And how does it help us understand very basic questions about how Germany held together? It turns out to be a fascinating question. One of the things that amazes the Americans about it is the Germans have out-manufactured the Americans. The 50.5 cal American machine gun is a classic machined, ancient piece of metalworking. This is stamped out of raw sheet metal, incredibly cheap, incredibly light, mass-manufactured in ways nobody had ever mass-manufactured a machine gun before, and it fires at a truly apocalyptic rate. In fact, if you pull the trigger, it melts itself with the speed with which it fires. Up to 2,000 rounds per minute have been measured. An extremely weapon, incredibly simple in its components, and absolutely fundamental to infantry combat. If you want to ask the question of how the Wehrmacht held together, one of the questions we need to go back to is not the naked weapons by themselves, but the man-machine synthesis, which the Germans perfect in ways which go back on the infantry side all the way to World War I. Integrating that with economic history, integrating that with the broader political history of the regime is, I think, a huge desideratum for mainstream historical research. And placing it in a systematic way within the history of the Third Reich is essential, because these weapons are part of the charisma of the Nazi regime. It's not for nothing that the first tanks of the German army are called boring things like tank number 1, tank number 2, tank number 3, and then from 1942 onwards, when things get serious, they're called Tiger, Panther, and so on. But there was a logic, really, to the reason why I stepped back from the story of steel and industry. And in some senses, it's a decision I don't regret, because it was a question that goes back to the fundamental balance of my argument and of the book, and that basic point I was making about German society. And so, in the last 5 minutes, what I want to do is focus on this other side of the German history of the war. Because one of the arguments that I made in Wages is that if you want to understand the real violence of the Nazi regime, as brutal as the use of forced labor in German industry was, and as horrendous as the consequences of pointing an MG42 at a large crowd of civilians or partisans lined up against a wall is, the violence of the regime originates not so much in industrial society, but in the tensions of that left-behind agrarian society lagging so far behind the productivity, standard of living and income of Western societies exemplified by Britain or the United States. It originates in the struggles of the German countryside in 3 ways. First and most directly, in the conquest of foreign territory, as a way of addressing that imbalance between Lebensraum and the German population, of giving the Germans the American circumstances which they dream after. It is no exaggeration to say, I think, that the Midwest of Canada and the United States of America serves fundamentally as the benchmark of the kind of vision that Hitler wants to implement in the Ukraine from 1941 onwards. Seizing land and giving people those 20 hectares, 40, 50 acres, and not a mule but a motorway, is definitely what Hitler is about. The second driver of violence from the countryside is the need for labor. The imperative of feeding Germany, of bringing in the harvest, is the driver of the first forced labor program from 1939 onwards. And the third and most direct element, underestimated until really the moment that I was writing with colleagues about this problem, Christian Gerlach is an absolutely crucial predecessor of the argument that I make. The third element is food. Because it's often said that there's a deep irrationality hiding in the Nazi regime, a regime desperate for forced labor, but unprecedentedly murderous. How, people ask, could Nazi Germany justify murdering 6 million Jews when it was so desperately short of labor? Surely this points to the absolute priority of ideology in the Nazi regime over any other consideration. Now, as I started by saying, I'm all about emphasizing the importance of ideology. It's completely undeniable, but that is a grotesquely simplistic way of understanding how ideology actually works. Because all the foreign labor in the world is useless to you if you can't feed them. And the Germans are leaders in nutritional and physiological research in this period, and they know that there is a threshold level. And if you feed 3 Ukrainian workers 1,500 calories each, you end up with 3 useless men. If you feed 1 Ukrainian worker 4,500 calories, you've got a miner. The logic is stark. Kill unnecessary eaters. What ideology actually enables you to do is to have, in their own terms, the moral courage to follow through on the murderous Malthusian imperative of a compressed war economy. Find people to kill, and ideology tells you who to kill first and in what order. So ideology does not sit at odds with an economic logic. In a perverse way, it supercharges it, dynamizes it, and turns it into absolutely lethal violence. It is no exaggeration to say that from 1941 onwards, the Germans are killing and executing and then deliberately starving millions upon millions of people, starting with the Jews, with a view to ensuring the food supply, the calorie, protein, and fat supply for their industrial armaments workforce. Now, this is a hugely contentious thing to say. Some German historians have pushed back against it. Tim Snyder has taken it lock, stock, and barrel. I've always personally felt a little bit squeamish about the argument that I made. And so I'll end with an archival find, more recent, that makes me feel a little bit better about the argument that I made in Wages. Because lurking, it turns out, in the uncatalogued regions of the German archive is an agency which hitherto had attracted no one's attention. And it's not the Agricultural Ministry, which was bombed out, and there's only maybe 20, 30 meters of files for it. Nor is it the agency that ran farms in general, likewise, victim of bomb damage. It turns out 3 levels down within the agricultural management of the Third Reich, there is an agency called, let me get to it, the Reichsstelle für Getreide. This is the Reichsagency for grain. But 3 levels down in the German war economy is where decisions of life and death are made with regard to calorie input. And the files for the Reichsstelle für Getreide are not only present, but there are several hundred meters of them, and they are as yet uncatalogued. So if you make, or not properly catalogued in the modern sense, but I've been able to make a series of selective dives into this catalogue, and what you see is extraordinary confirmation, I would argue, of the kind of holistic way in which feeding, violence, and the mobilization of labor were linked together by the Nazi regime from 1939 onwards. And I'll just show you there's some documentation we can talk about in which you actually see the bureaucrats saying, are we serious about what we're going to do here? People really going to die? And they say, yes, absolutely, that is what we're going to do. And we need a decision by the Führer to make sure we do this. And then you get the precious, you get the Rosetta Stone of the German food economy. We don't need to go into details here. We can talk about it perhaps afterwards. But what this shows you is all the way down the side here, every single category of consumer. And what you've got here is from the highest levels of ranking, so children, high priority, then super heavy workers. Then as you go down here, you've got institutionally provided, non-Wehrmacht formations, and then here, crucially, camps. So what this is a spreadsheet which shows you the total allocation of food between different classes of consumers within the Third Reich, ranging from the highest racially prioritized to the lowest, including camps and foreign worker camps. And if you go into the details of the way in which food is being shuffled around this spreadsheet, what it shows you is this, that between 40 and 43, the Nazi regime is pursuing precisely that strategy of polarization that I was telling you about. Concentrate food on the valuable, concentrate food on those who work, and let the rest starve. Shoot some, but let the rest starve, and when they become useless, ship them back. Prioritize those who have high performance, introduce what's called performance feeding, split the population between those who overperform and underperform their quotas, feed the ones who overperform, starve the ones who don't. In other words, triage, 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 triage. And as a result of this, hundreds of thousands of people first, and then ultimately millions, will starve to death in the forced labor program of the Third Reich. On that somber note, I'll end and open up for questions. But what I want to argue and suggest is that this is still an open research agenda. Massive as that book turned out to be, it never seemed to me anything more like a gigantic thought experiment. And in that sense, to me, the ongoing exploration in these archives, whether it's down the industrial or the agricultural side, is the really exciting thing that lies ahead. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your attention.
I would just like to say before we start the questions that I've been a member of NYMAS for 30 years, and this is one of the most amazing talks I've ever heard.
Thank you.
Let me just ask you, the drop in German production on steel in 1941, where they assumed they were going to destroy the Soviet Union, which is way too optimistic.
Yeah.
Why did they do something so radically and not give themselves a cushion?
Yeah.
And what were they turning to? What were they going to do with all the steel capacity?
Right, so that's an absolutely great question, and the basic answer is the fact that they have to make these trade-offs, that there is no cushion, just tells you how knife-edge, shoestring this war economy is. Another classic instance of this is the nuclear program. The Germans knew that nuclear had potential to create a really dirty weapon, but when they do the math, they figure out how much it's going to cost, they size it up, and they say, could this possibly have any bearing on the war effort in the next 2 years on the Eastern Front? And the answer, as we know from the Manhattan Project, which went well and was driven with maximum effort, is it comes too late to decide the war in Europe, even for the side that's going to win. So whereas the British and the Americans adopt the nuclear program on the basis of a precautionary principle. We're going to give ourselves a cushion, because hell, if Hitler's developing the program, we need the antidote, even if it costs us the equivalent of an entire year of German armaments output. So when you come from the US-UK side, you're used to thinking in terms of cushions, reserves, safety, the logic of D-Day. Well, we just don't do anything until we're really damn certain that we can supply this operation. That is not how the German war effort was run at any point in the war. And so as soon as they see, hell, we didn't use anywhere near as much ammunition as we thought in France, they switch out and they switch it into new priorities. Like I was saying, steel is used as a fine-tuning mechanism. It's almost like the Federal Reserve and interest rates. They use this huge lumpy raw material to shift, and what do they put it into? Investment, 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 investment. Because what they're going to have to build and what they're planning for is not a long war with the Soviet Union. That's a done deal. Their army beat France. Their army had failed 3 times to beat France in World War I. This army had beat France. If it can beat France, it can definitely do what their army had able to do in World War I, which is beat the Russians. Beating the Russians is not impossible for the Germans. They've already done it once in 1917, 1918. So if this army with this equipment can do France, it can definitely do Russia. So the big thing on the horizon is the United States and Britain. And for that, you're going to need really heavy-duty infrastructure, because the aircraft are made out of aluminium, but the aircraft are going to fly with fuel and rubber you're going to build in gigantic chemicals facilities. And those are hugely resource-intensive. And so the shift is out of immediate stockpiling of ammo into infrastructure. And the most notorious place for this is Auschwitz. So Auschwitz shoots up the priority of the agenda from the fall of 41, because it is going to be, first of all, a synthetic rubber plant, and then it expands dramatically as kind of mission creep. And by 43, 44, it's a full spectrum synthetic chemicals plant that can do everything from rubber all the way through to air fuel. And it is the single largest and most expensive investment project of the Third Reich. And that's all about steel and concrete and manpower. So that's exactly what they do. They shift out of immediate consumption stockpiling to investment for the future war effort. They take the pace out a little bit. They shift towards consumer activities to a degree as well. But overall, it's from the time profile, it's a shift from immediate needs to a longer term investment in the bigger war that is to come, the third war after the Soviet Union.
No, excellent talk first. But my question is, a lot of military historians, they focus on like all these what ifs, you know.
Yeah.
What if Hitler had just kept going to Moscow in September 1941?
Yeah.
What if there was a Mediterranean strategy instead of invading the Soviet Union? What if Hitler didn't, of course the big one, what if Hitler didn't declare war on the U.S. at the end of 1941? And your work seems to suggest that they just can't, even with those changes, they can't overcome essentially the material constraints. So I wonder if there's, as you've done more work, and as you've thought about this stuff, are there any like what ifs that you think could have, allowed Germany to overcome again its material constraints and again attain a stalemate, if not win the war?
Thanks very much, and that's also a very, very charitable and I think, from my point of view, constructive way of posing the questions. I appreciate it. I'm a determinist on the Eastern Front. I'm pretty hardcore on the Eastern Front, and this is a kind of generational thing. So I'm very much influenced by the Freiburg military historians who from the 70s onwards ran this anti-Manstein critique of the counterfactualism that runs through post-war German after the battle stuff. The famous Manstein lost victories, but for Hitler, the German Wehrmacht and its genius operators would have won this. I find that completely unconvincing. Barbarossa, if you look at the details of the operational planning, not Hitler, if you look at the details of the operational planning of Barbarossa, it surely is the most irresponsible military operation ever conceived. It is spectacular. This takes the not having any reserves to a kind of insane level of hubris, which I think can only be justified on racial grounds. They were assuming the Russians would just sit statically and wait to be overrun. It's a disastrous operation. That's a counterfactual I would just shut down. The amazing thing is they weren't stopped earlier with much higher losses that they got as far as they did. It's conceivable you can roll the dice and like 100 dice all come up 6 at once in some wargaming scenario, but I'm not buying that as a strong counterfactual. I think the sit tight in the Mediterranean strategy is overwhelmingly the favorite here, right? Sit tight, let the enormous, and we underestimate this to an extent, the historic shock of defeating France the way they did, and the conquest of, just let that sink in. Let the dust settle. Let's see how the geopolitical chips settle down. And thanks to my lovely life partner, we've been doing a lot of traveling in the Mediterranean. I've widened my horizons. Wages of Destruction is in some ways a very parochial book. I've learned a lot about the Mediterranean War. It's a fascinating display, but I would insist in the end it's a fascinating display of the same basic causal pattern. They can't barely even supply the Africa Corps, which is a trivial military operation. The prospect of a really long-range war, I think, hugely overstretches Germany's operational capacities. Fundamentally, the Germans never build a really even more than one dimension of modern military power. They never build a viable naval threat, and in air power, as we know, they're basically confined to tactical operations. They never build the 4-engine bombers that will require in huge numbers to mount a strategic threat, let alone the double whammy of long-range interceptors and strategic bombers, which is actually necessary to really win the war in the air war. So my sense is that really they're a one-dimensional force, and it's a force which has achieved something totally spectacular in France, so why not try it again against the Soviets? I think the attack on the Soviet Union is more plausible than we generally reckon. It's just that it's bound to fail. Why are they in such a hurry? Fundamentally, why don't they just sit tight? I'd come back to my basic point. Strategic pressure. And they feel intense strategic pressure from the mobilization of the US economy, which they are following acutely closely. And Roosevelt's May 1940 address to Congress, where he says we're going for full spectrum dominance. We're going to build the biggest two-ocean navy anyone's ever seen. We're going to have 85,000 aircraft, and I'm introducing conscription, and we're going to have a big army as well. That really, from the point of view of the German planners, if you look inside the economic apparatus, is decisive. That shocks them. And it reawakens all those senses of inferiority. Ford starts getting talked about. The River Run plant, it's River Run, isn't it? Even if they take ages to actually debug the air plants they're ever going to make, it terrifies the Germans that Ford is getting into the aircraft business, is just nightmarishly bad news for them. So that is where I think the source of the strategic pressure is. And of then the constrained move that follows, the Soviet Union attack is not the least, is not in fact crazy from their point of view. I just think it isn't going to work.
Could you possibly address the effect and tie it into what you were talking about of the Allied bombing of German industries, particularly the precision bombing, which was done not only by the Americans but by the British also?
Okay, so I'm a revisionist on bombing. There's no doubt at all about the devastating effect of American bombing from 1944 onwards, right? I mean, it's indisputable. I find it very difficult to see why the debate often takes the form that it does. This is a weapon that works. It's absolutely devastating. I need to get to the steel thing. I'm going to get there in a second, because I need to show you some dents in the curve. Let's see. We're going to get there in a second. I want the long run one. there is, I think, a preconception on the part of both the British and American after the battle analysts that strategic bombing was a mistake. It was a costly mistake, both in terms of manpower. The losses, as we know, amongst the flyers are horrendous, hugely expensive, in the end ineffectual. And I find that unconvincing at two levels. A, the damage done by the Americans from the spring of 44 onwards is devastating to the Germans. It consumes huge quantities of resources in air defense, and then after the D-Day operation preparation has ended, they lay waste to Germany, completely devastating its transport infrastructure, as they do, in fact, to large parts of northwestern Europe. Where I think I'm more revisionist is in arguing that, in fact, the British already had the Third Reich by the throat from the spring of 43 onwards. Because what the British began to do from the spring of 43 was to send heavy formations against the Ruhr regularly. It wasn't very accurate. The British are flying at night and they're only just perfecting electronic pathfinding. But the Ruhr is close and it's easy to find once you've set a lot of it alight. And if you don't hit one city, you're quite likely to hit another city. And the crucial thing is that it's upstream in the industrial food chain. So the thing about precision bombing is you really need to hit the precise target. The thing about hitting the Ruhr is that whatever you hit, you're bound to hit something useful to someone in an unpredictable way. And from the spring, from March 1943 onwards, this is underrated, the sense of anxiety within Speer's ministry mounts night by night as they see what the British are doing to Düsseldorf, to Cologne, to Dortmund, to Bochum, city after city. They're making extraordinary plans for the mass evacuation of the Germans had been lackadaisical about evacuation. The bombing hadn't been very heavy. They had some very big bunkers that made people feel good. The German houses have great cellars, so people survive the way they don't in jerry-built English buildings. They've been kind of coping. And all of a sudden, they're facing this brutal onslaught with thousands of people dying several nights in a row. And they start talking about the total evacuation of the civilian population, all old men, all women, all children, to leave the Ruhr, leaving nothing but adult males and females and slave laborers working under a kind of Spartan regime. And of course, the brutal climax of all of this is the assault on Hamburg, where the British make real, in a single night, all of the darkest fantasies of air war strategists ever since the first Zeppelins, right? The total devastation of a key city in a single night by fire, tens of thousands of people killed, utter destruction of the city. And they do it one more time at Kassel, the city that makes Tiger tanks. And this leaves the Germans shattered. You can see inside the Speer ministry, people are saying we might as well just kill ourselves. If we cannot put up an air defense, this is all over. And the British pull off, they pull away. And they pull away for two reasons. They are taking huge attritional casualties because the Germans can see them coming. They've got densely packed air defenses. They can muster them really quickly because the British have to fly over the same zones. And they flinch. Even though the logic of bombing is clearly attritional and they understand it, and that's what they're inflicting on the other side, they flinch because they don't think they can hold on. And they are misled after Hamburg and Kassel into thinking they can do the same thing to Berlin. And if they can do that to Berlin, the war's over, they imagine. And it turns out, of course, that three things. A, Berlin is enormous. B, it's not as flammable. There's four things. Three, it's an incredibly long way away, so you suffer huge losses from flying into Berlin. And crucially, from an economic point of view, Berlin is all downstream. It's a major industrial sector, but it's just manufacturing, it's just armament. So if you kill a factory there, you stop it, some form of armaments production for a couple of days, but you do not do the sort of damage that's rippling through the German economy from the Ruhr, from the spring of 43. So I think an operational error on the part of the British, in part, a kind of moral failure in the face of the losses they were suffering, but above all, an operational error in thinking they would do better against Berlin, is decisive for shaping the historiography of the air war. Because if they had kept on pounding on the German war effort in the West, regardless of the cost, I don't think there's any question that the Speer ministry was in trouble. The Speer ministry says so itself. We're stuck. Armaments production is flat. The armaments miracle is over. They go scrambling to find new miracles to make. They have to bring in Himmler to run the SS Gestapo discipline through Germany's factories. This thing, the wheels are coming off. Mussolini has collapsed. There's a real sense of crisis within the regime. Kursk fails. Everything is really grinding to a halt. And the shift to Berlin, though it's damaging and painful to the big city, is not the same sort of threat. And that, to me, is really decisive. Who, of course, would have benefited from a more effective air war in the fall of 43? It would have been Stalin. So this would have given a different complexion to the whole war. But that's my take on bombing.
Did you look at the sulfuric acid? Sulfuric acid, I saw some things about that. And why didn't they just delay everything a year? I mean, they could have not provoked everybody till the sulfuric acid, their steel, and their propaganda was in place.
So there's a whole set of questions, I think, about other inputs that one could, A, look at as keys to the history of the German war economy, and B, also potential targets for strategic attack. Steel is not, in fact, the ideal target for strategic attack. It's foundries and the various components of the heavy industrial food chain that are. The big question is why they didn't go after synthetic fuel earlier. The Germans themselves are disbelieving about this. They begin to believe Stalin's position that surely the British and the Americans must be aiming to bleed the Soviets dry, because otherwise they would have gone after them. I think there is a fear of losses. The hydration plants are a long way out of range. And there are a variety of chemical plants that they no doubt could have assaulted. It would also have been possible to write this history through a variety of other materials. I would perhaps not have focused on acids in particular, but aluminium and copper would have made key variables to follow through as well, for certain.
Thank you for a very, very interesting talk. I did my first book on the Blitzkrieg about 30 years ago. I did 2 books on the German war economy about 20 years ago. And I fundamentally agree that the Blitzkrieg was based on horse-drawn transportation.
Yeah.
Only a quarter of the German army was motorized.
So I'm guessing who you must be. But
we agree on that. All right. What we disagree on is I would argue that the main elements of the economy are manpower and oil, because you need oil to move all the steel production and ammunition production to the front.
Yeah.
And also I would question whether or not the United States and Britain won the war. We were certainly winners. We were certainly winners of the war, but the heavy lifting was done by the Chinese and the Russians.
Yes.
And I would argue that heavy lifting was complete before we even entered the war. At the Battle of Moscow, the defeat.
Yeah.
When they didn't get the oil they needed to continue, and the Blitzkrieg economy collapsed. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, let me start with the most important point there, which is clearly simply to say it out loud, and one cannot say this loudly enough, that obviously the Wehrmacht is bled dry by the Soviet Union. 85% of the battle casualties of the Wehrmacht are inflicted on the Eastern Front. And the encounter between the German economy and the Soviet economy, especially after the losses that have been inflicted by the Wehrmacht on the Soviets early in the war, is a much more equal one in terms of material than we generally credit. The Germans themselves, and this was then amplified in Cold War propaganda, which was borderline racist, imagine, as it were, themselves being overwhelmed by wave upon wave of manpower, of endless material, which of course underrates the fighting skill, the quality, the operational genius of many of the Soviet commanders and the bravery of the Soviet troops. As it were, the Germans assert themselves as quality defeated by quantity, not allowing the qualities of the other side. All of that is clearly in need of revision. And if you are saying, well, in that case, okay, so the geometry of this stacks up rather differently because they're not overwhelmed and defeated by a regime that was massively superior to them in material, the way the British and the Americans were, and undoubtedly inferior in terms of quality, in terms of fighting capacity, then your logic is kind of odd, because it hangs loose as a kind of determining force, whereas the damage is actually being done by the Soviet Union, which is operating on a different basis. And I would, broadly speaking, not disagree with you. What one would need to do is to write a parallel history, and people have done this, Mark Harris and Stephen Kotkin, of the qualitative-quantitative synthesis that is the Soviet war economy, and its devastating firepower, and its devastating capacity, and it's even greater than that of Nazi Germany. So I wouldn't disagree with this analysis, I would agree, and one would then need to understand what it was that gave the Soviet regime its incredible mobilizing capacity. And that clearly has, I think, and I am a kind of unapologetic here in countering the kind of post-Cold War take, it has something to do with the revolution. To my mind, it has something to do with the fact that the Bolshevik regime comes out of a revolution and a full-on, extraordinarily violent civil war. And that hardens the Soviet regime in ways that Sheila Fitzpatrick at Chicago, for instance, has analyzed and described, and creates in the Soviet regime a regime which is capable of fundamentally changing the parameters of Soviet society. So to bring this back to my own argument, I'd say, okay, look at Germany and the Soviet Union. Both of these have huge structural disadvantages. They both have enormous agrarian sectors. I'm saying having a huge agrarian sector is an insuperable, unovercomable problem for Germany, Look what the Soviet Union does. If you're a revolutionary, socially transformative regime, you can shift that parameter. You can force industrialization, you can take individual farmers and turn them into subordinate collective farmers so that you have them under your thumb, so that when the war comes, you can force people to work at the threat of starvation, even in the countryside, and you can prevent what happening to the Soviet Union, what happened to the Tsarist regime in 1917 and 18, what gave the Germans their victory, namely the internal collapse of the Russian state. Now, I would grant that that is clearly the complement to the argument that I'm making about Russia, but remember the caveat I made at the beginning. There's lots of different ways in which the Germans can lose this war. There's many different ways in which they can lose it. Their defeat is massively overdetermined and results from huge overkill. And if the war had gone on for more months more, it would have been even bigger overkill because we would most likely have used nuclear weapons against their intended target, which was Germany, right? So there's lots of different ways in which they lose. Indeed, I completely agree the Soviet Union is in fact the hammer and the anvil for most of the war of this destruction. The only qualification to those quantitative comparisons I would make is just the sheer expense of the air war. And the expense of the air war waged against Britain and America, even though it cost nowhere near as many lives, and it is not doing direct damage to the German military machine, is enormous. It's exorbitant. And that is a huge piece of the pie, and one of the reasons why the Wehrmacht is increasingly bled dry on the Eastern Front from 42 onwards. So they complement each other, but we wouldn't disagree there at all. On the issue of oil, sure, oil is absolutely crucial. There are passages in the book about oil. I don't really disagree that it's a crucial variable. One of the reasons why the Germans stay with horses is they can't afford to motorize. They don't have the rubber or the oil. When they think about it, they get stuck. They do the math. You know this better than I have a suspicion of who you might be. And so they've done the math, you know, and they, in fact, in the spring of 41, we've both read the papers in Freiburg, where they discuss demotorizing the entire German army because they didn't have enough fuel. They confine the Italian Navy to port because they don't have enough fuel oil for it to steam around the Mediterranean. They're decreasingly paralyzed by their oil. And the amazing thing is when they imagine how they're going to escape the oil dilemma, right? One is synthetic production, and the other one is, hell, you know what we need to do is conquer the Caucasus. Okay? That's the strategic escape, is like a vaulting, increasingly insane and strategic overreach. So the two things complement each other. In the end, through rationing and by limiting their war effort, we both know they managed to sustain things through to the fall of 44. But the damage is inside the Luftwaffe. The pilots can't fly, they can't train, so they're easy meat by the summer of 44. They're not getting more than a couple of hours in the cockpit before they go up and they're shot down. So it eats its way into the entire fabric of the German war effort, and Battle of the Bulge is the ultimate. It's a blitzkrieg to capture a petrol dump. It's a kind of insane reductio ad absurdum of military operations. No real disagreement there, I don't think.
I have two questions. First of all, in the war planning in Germany, was there some implicit feeling or attitude that maybe nobody wanted to admit? That being that they had to win the war quickly or they weren't going to win it? And question two, what were the immediate consequences of the British shifting their policy of changing their campaign and going and bombing Berlin and other cities other than the Ruhr? And can this be compared in an anemic fashion, admittedly, to Germany in the Battle of Britain, ceasing their bombings of the airfields and going after London?
On the second part, which is simpler, yes, it's similar. It's a little bit like that. Air war, another way of thinking about this, air war is preeminently attritional. You put your entire force up whenever the weather permits. You commit a very large part of your force every single night. You count the number that come back. You count the number you shot down and how much physical damage you did. It's a classically attritional struggle. Nevertheless, there are mistakes you can make. Right? Nevertheless, there are things you can do wrong, and it is arguable. I don't think it would have decided the Battle of Britain for the Luftwaffe, but that shift clearly takes the pressure off the RAF. By all means, bomb up capital cities, especially if all you've got is Ju-88s and Heinkels, right? Because you cannot actually do any devastating damage to anything that matters very much. It's a much bigger problem for the Germans by 44 when they face enormous Allied bomber fleets that can really wreck an entire city. Then you kind of have to defend your cities. Then you have to put your air force up. And so then you can really get the hammer and anvil thing going, which destroys the Luftwaffe very quickly in 44. on the bigger point that you're asking, are the Germans explicit about the time pressure? Absolutely. And a lot of the work I'm doing in the book is to trace every single moment when they say, damn, we've got to hurry. And what is it that they say? What is it that's driving them? And it's remarkable how often they're explicitly saying, because in the end, American supplies are going to tell. It's hard to exaggerate how deeply ingrained in the German thinking about war the experience of World War I is. And their understanding of what happened to them in World War I is they lost against globalized enemies. They lost against globalized enemies when Hitler says if a world war starts in January 1939, the Weltkrieg starts when America enters the war. Now, America can enter in two different ways, directly or simply by supplying the British and the French and all its other allies. And this is a huge anxiety. Despite the difficulties in American Congress, you'd think they would be rest easy given isolationism. They are desperately concerned about the scale of American supply, and one of the reasons Hitler is so lackadaisical about this, declaring war in December 1941 is, in his mind, America's already in the fight, and the advantage of declaring war is you can openly sink their ships. That's literally how they put it. They're already in the fight, we might as well just declare war. But from 38, 39 onwards, this is the question again and again and again. And you'll have tidy-minded military bureaucrats going, the lesson of World War I, mein Führer, is we must prepare, we must have stocks, we must lay down stockpiles of raw materials and oil and ammunition. And again, and I think strategically quite correctly, Hitler says, you're totally missing the point. If we have to fight a tidy, long-run war, we lose it. All you're doing is tidily preparing for ultimate defeat. If we fight a war at all, and I am convinced we are going to fight a war, and in fact, when you talk to me like that, I'm kind of half convinced you don't want to fight a war. Because when we think about a war that way, we know we lose it. So back reversing the logic here, and he's quite clever, right? If you're arguing that way, you probably are amongst the people who don't want to go to war. Those of us who are serious about war understand that we must strike now, and we must strike hard. What they don't do is patch that together into any kind of coherent image of what a blitzkrieg is going to look like. They don't add up and say, all right, we need fight, we need dive bombers, and we need more tanks, and we need, they don't do all that kind of operational planning. What they say is we just need to strike hard and fast. And that's not original in German military doctrine. That goes all the way back to Frederick the Great. I mean, that is how Germany, this is a kind of classic conclusion, I think, and it's a stereotype, but it's broadly speaking true. Germany has to fight its wars hard and fast and achieve as much decision as it possibly can, and often its best hope after that is just hanging in there till the coalition that opposes you collapses. And this is the great hope by 44-45, a miracle like that in the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, where the Tsarina dies, the Tsar takes over, they make peace in 1763. That's what they're looking for in 1944-45. The rest of the time, you've got to win quickly.
Your presentation was marvelous. You're really great. I mean, very charismatic. You're very entertaining. You're fabulous. Very theatrical.
But I can see
you're
the
great.
Coming. Yeah.
No, you're quite good.
There
really.
better be a butt coming.
No, but seriously, this is another what-if question. I may have answered it already, I guess. But seriously, if they just waited, like 6 years. Okay, they put up a smokescreen of peace, drinking beer, and everybody's happy. They kept the United States as isolationists because they weren't doing anything, and they were secretly arming, getting the jets together, fleets of jets, getting their nuclear power together, their teats, their Tiger tanks. Like, by 45, they said, well, let's keep the pact with Russia. Let's keep them. Let's not attack Russia. By 45, they would have been powerful. What would have happened?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is of course, as I've said, I think this is the big counterfactual. But it kind of, it's really, what is it? The leopard can't change it. Is it the leopard with the stripes? I can never remember this. Tigers and spots, leopards and stripes. So you're asking them to be fundamentally other than they are, because the gentleman's question at the front here is central. Hitler's entire worldview is Manichaean, and you might say manic. Right? It's driven by an intense sense of time pressure, because out there lurking is not a benign world, which if you give it time will give you the promised land. Out there is the world Jewish conspiracy. And they are just waiting to throttle you. And they have lots of different ways of doing it. Some of it open, but most of the time, precisely when you think things are going well and things are calm and peaceful, that's the way liberals talk. Or it's the way the communists talk. And Andreas Hillgruber makes this point, that if you want to, there's a huge difference between Stalin and Hitler in this respect. Stalin thinks time is on his side, because he's a Marxist. He's a descendant of 19th century liberal optimism. He believes that in the end, history will give the revolution victory. And so you can suck up a really quite stomach-churning kind of, oh my God, of 3940 when you make a pact with Hitler and you expect it to produce 1914, 15, 16, the Somme, Verdun, all that good stuff, and instead what you get is Blitzkrieg and Poland and France falling in 6 months, and capitalism turns out to be totally weak at the knees, and damn, now you're facing Germany. Stalin can sit back and go, relax, it's still going to be okay. The British sends to Stafford Cripps, and he's out of his mind, and he's going, you've got to enter the war, you've got to flip sides. And Stalin looks at the British and says, look, as far as I can see, you have a navy. As far as I can see, Germany doesn't have a navy. Why are you asking me to enter this war? You have not lost this war. I can see why you want me to enter this war, is you want me to fight your war for you, and the Germans end up having to fight the war with the Soviet Union, and that's exactly what happens. Stalin has got this, the space, the time given by an optimistic view of history. Hitler's a Gnostic. He doesn't know whether in the end history's on Germany's side or not. And the only way to find out is to test it, and to test it urgently, and to go on struggling. Specifically, what the Germans are convinced of, and they're not wrong, is that if you stay in the Hitler-Stalin pact, and there's a great cartoon, I wish I'd put it up here, by one of the British newspapers from 39, which inverts our normal presumptions. Because what it shows is a tiny little Germany embraced by a gigantic Russia. If you give that pact time, where does the resource balance shift? Who emerges as the dominant party here? And the conventional assumption at the time is it's not Germany, it's the Soviet Union. Because what have the Soviets got? They've got grain and they've got oil. So you say the Germans conquered all of Western Europe, but what does the rest of Western Europe need? Grain and oil. They need even more than the Germans. The Germans conquer themselves several large protein, calorie, fat, and oil deficits to go on top of their own. Right? Which in fact makes them even more dependent on Stalin. So the idea is if you go with that scenario, which in many ways, and so the people who push this are people like Ribbentrop, right? He's very serious about this alliance. And the big counterfactual is tie the Japanese more intimately. Right, tie them in properly. Why not have a transcontinental pact? And this is the thing that really, really worries American grand strategists, right? You can see Spickman and people like that at Yale are saying America confronts the world island. When America confronts the world island, this is when this is the only coalition that could really threaten, the only coalition that could really threaten the United States, which is why China surges up the priority list. The Americans really need to make sure that doesn't happen. But the reason why that can't be allowed to work is that the Germans fear a slide in the wrong direction to their disadvantage.
I was wondering if you can fit Richard Overy into this story, historiographically speaking, or if it's just not appropriate. In the dichotomy between sort of, the American system of mass production, encapsulated in the B-24 Liberator bomber, which is a terrible piece of equipment, but we built lots of it, versus a German tendency to over-design things, and in that way, really never kind of mastering the mass production techniques.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a kind of inside baseball question, but there's a short answer, and it's quite, you've seen the footnotes. This book is a long, sustained, and largely, I have to say, critical engagement with Overy's work. I disagree with Richard about every single aspect of the history of the Nazi regime, starting in 1933. And I say this in a sense with regret. He was a good sponsor of mine early in my career, and I really appreciate the very respectful but fundamentally dismissive and critical review he wrote of the book. But it was polite, and we've remained in that kind of tone. But we disagree about everything. Why the Allies won? Duh. Why the Allies won? This is a complicated book, which it seems to me is sort of puffing up a set of questions which in the end have simple, very powerful answers, is refusing the logic of the materialism that I'm insisting upon. So many different ways. Let me tell you the ways the Allies could have won, would be my response. Whereas his is a sort of knife-edge argument, but for this, but for that, critical, nail-type logic. And that seems to me to be completely topsy-turvy. The Allies won any number of different ways in which this could have ended, and they all basically have the same outcome with even higher levels of destruction. Overkill. My closest compadre in the Anglophone scene is David Edgerton, whose histories of Britain are basically, tightly meshed with mine. We kind of need each other. We have to be right for each other, otherwise they fall. deeper into the argument, WWII, all the way back to his excellent and path-breaking PhD thesis on the German aircraft industry, is one of the key people who argue for rationalization, right? Rationalization is the key to the German war effort. Now, look at that. Where's the rationalization there? One-for-one movement. You increase the steel output, you get more ammo. You reduce the steel input, you get less ammo. There's not a whole hell of a lot of magic going on here, right? To my mind, WWII does is not to succumb exactly to the ideology and the propaganda of the Speer ministry, but at least give it ample space. And he wrote that interesting book about interrogations. Richard is somebody who's lived within the archives of the Imperial War Museum, which are dominated to a very considerable extent by interviews, by interrogations done. This is one of his major sources. And it's true also of my PhD supervisor, Alan Millward. It's hard for us to imagine, or for me anyway, somebody of my generation, but for Millward and WWII, Speer was still alive. You could interview these people in their early work. Millward in particular has a remarkably kind of intimate relationship with Speer and Kell and Pleiger, all of these people who, for my generation, are Jenny Sudair, who should probably have been executed at Nuremberg, but are, for that generation, of British historians who are becoming Europeans, are traveling to Europe, learning German, French, in a moment in which Britain is really turning inwards, and they're going out to Europe to do this kind of work. There's a kind of, I think, what's it called, that hostage scenario where you slide in a sense into the mentality of the Stockholm Syndrome of the people that you're interviewing. And I mean, that's a strong reading, but I mean it quite, I had to write a piece, an obituary for Alan Millward, and it was very striking in retrospect how close he is. He thanks Dr. Speer in his preface for useful interviews he gave him on the war effort. Now, that tradition, I traced it back in some of my footnotes to the interrogations of 44-45. And the British are suffering already then from some sort of complex. They interview these Speer people. And many of these guys, like that Geilenberg guy, he's a blue-collar guy. He's a thug. I mean, I don't mean that in a classist sense. He is running concentration camp armaments plants with Gestapo and SS minders in 44-45. These guys have blood on their hands as they are making that final surge of weapons, which impresses everybody so much. The British sit down and interview them, and they're adding PhDs to people's names who don't even have them. And whose social background would, in Germany, if you knew anything about the caste system of German society, would rule out the very possibility that Herr Sauer could possibly be Dippel-Ig Dr. Sauer, right? It's an unthinkable kind of aberration. He's a Nazi guy who came up brown-shirted through the organization, and he's hanging Germans. And this is the really striking thing. Not German Jews and not Soviet Protestant workers, but German plant engineers for failing to meet Speer's criteria. And the British sit down and say, please tell us, how you survived in the face of our bombing. And Sauer, of course, says, well, how much time have you got? I can indeed keep you happy regaling you with the stories of the great triumphs of the Speer armaments ministry. So there's a real slippage that happens, and the generation that I'm coming out of is that really of German critical historiography of the 70s and 80s. We grew up on the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the defining moment, and that inflects everything. So I'm asking the Gita Sereni question harder than Gita Sereni, because the idea that Speer only learned about the Holocaust when Himmler gave a speech in 43 is bizarre, right? Speer's a key man in the regime, and they are distributing food to kill Jews and other people from the moment he comes into office. He's at all the meetings where they do this. So these people are really different from the way that I think both WWII and Millward imagined them to be. This is a kind of shift in historiographical perception.
Could you comment on whether or not the Persian Gulf Supply Service Command had, what extent...
Say that again? Sorry,
the Persian Gulf Supply Service Command of the Lend-Lease, did that have any noticeable or useful effect for the Soviet Union in their defense against the Germans at all?
Yes, so this is where the work of Mark Harrison, whose book I put up, is really decisive. So, well, there's two different lines towards this, right? One is from the Allied side and is a kind of story of the global war, and the other is the story from inside the Soviet war effort. But I want to put it up because he's a decisive figure for our generation, particularly on the Soviet side. Mark Harrison, professor of economics at Warwick University, has done just, I mean, truly heroic work in the Soviet archives at a time when working in Russia was no fun. So there are two dimensions to this. One is what we know from the inside of the Soviet regime, and the other is, as it were, the global war that supply center sort of demonstrates. And it's worth, I think, perhaps just saying something about those global dimensions first of all. So the crucial move is that the British in 41 rapidly destroy the Italian East African Empire. And the advantage of that is they clear out the entire Indian Ocean, restoring British control of the Indian Ocean, as they had done in World War I. And the advantage of that is that Roosevelt can then declare this a zone free for the delivery of Lend-Lease goods directly from the United States into the Persian Gulf and into that supply center. And that is one of the quickest routes up then into the Caucasus, into the Soviet Union by way of Central Asia. Now, the scale of that kind of operation, matched by the kind of things you see at Torch, right, where the British and the Americans send troops from Scotland directly down to North Africa, in highly coordinated convoys into the Mediterranean, along the Mediterranean coastline, or across the Atlantic in a single bound, right? Entire divisional strengths, fully equipped armored divisions across the Atlantic, right? And then drop them in North Africa. That kind of global logistical operation is just not anywhere within reach of the Germans at any point in the war. They simply, they can manage a hop from maybe Sicily or Sardinia or southern Italy across to Tunis or into Libya, but the idea of projecting force across the Atlantic in a single go, not Normandy style by way of Britain, but directly across, is out of their reach entirely. And this is why I think the Persian Gulf Command is so mind-bending, because that's literally a logistical operation. Then it flows into the Soviet Union, and then Mark Harrison's statistics begin to pick it up, because he has combed through, really the graveyard of Stalinist statistics where people go to lose their minds, right? And he has worked his way through this stuff, and what he has been able to show, and this is absolutely crucial, is the timeline. Right? As soon as the Cold War ended, America announced that they, in fact, won the war in the East, right, by way of Lend-Lease, which the Soviet regime, without which it couldn't have coped. And this is clearly incorrect. Right? The two crucial defensive stands, the first, and it's more than defensive, the counteroffensive at Moscow in December 1941, the first disastrous defeat for the Wehrmacht, basically the humiliating, the evisceration of an entire Army Group Center in December 41, and the stand at Stalingrad, and then this genius counterstrike are done almost entirely unassisted by the West. There's little dribbles of stuff that the British are able to put in, but the kind of quality of equipment they're getting is laughable. It's totally non-viable on the Eastern Front in the main, right? So that early supply, those convoys are crucial politically, because they give Stalin the sense that we're all part of the same fight, but Britain and the United States are not really able to supply much at that early stage. What does matter is the pipeline that comes on stream after Stalingrad. And it matters above all logistically, because what the Americans can give to the Soviets is what the Germans don't have: heavy-duty rear area logistics. And what this enables the Red Army to do is to fight these amazing pounding counter-offensive operations from the spring of 43, wave after wave after wave. I mean, you need somebody like Glantz. I gather Glantz has been here, but you need somebody with his kind of sweeping command of the Eastern Front to really do justice to it, because the scale is epic and the relentlessness. No one in the West has ever fought a war like the Soviets fought from the spring of 43. And against huge obstacles, because you've got people like Manstein operating on the other side, and very well equipped, hardened German veterans with decent equipment who will fight you to the death, inch after inch after inch. But the Soviets can sustain that because they've got this supply chain. So we don't supply them with any cutting edge. The idea that we make any weapons that they would want to use is absurd, right? What we do is we supply them with heavy trucks. And that is the equipment that allows them to keep moving, to mount these amazing armored operations, the most epic of which is probably Bagration, and then the push all the way through to the Polish border by the end of 44. And for that, the American supplies are really crucial. And what it enables the Soviet Union to do is to take the foot off the pedal. Right? The scale of mobilization in the Soviet Union in 41, 42 is probably unlike anything ever seen. Maybe Vietnam in the 1970s or China at the height of the Civil War has similar levels of mobilization, 60, 65% of GDP going into the war effort and domestically sourced. It's literally true that if you don't work, you don't eat. Literally true. There was a wave of epidemics and starvation, famine behind the Soviet lines, not in the German-controlled bit, because they are so concentrated on the war effort. All the stories that WWII does tell very well of these improvised factories which are being stamped out of the frozen ground. literally as they, they roll the tanks off, unfinished, onto the firing line, this sort of thing. And you can't sustain that. Even Stalinism can't sustain that. And so they take the foot off the pedal from 43 onwards, and into that gap flow the Lend-Lease supplies, and crucially, operationally, into this rear area business, where they're using American radios, American food rations, American logistics, to feed the Soviet-supplied cutting edge. The air war on the east, it's easy to slight and underrate, and that is an area where the inferiority of Western equipment is not as noticeable as it is on the ground. But with regard to tanks and artillery, the Soviets are in a class of their own on the Allied side, a match for the Germans for most of the war. In the air war, I would agree that there is various types of aircraft that we supply to them that the Soviets can make use of. And the air battle in the east swings back and forth. By 44, the Soviets have a decisive advantage, but that is certainly an area of assistance.
Dr. Tooze, thank you.